found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great powers or beings there be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and call them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. 1. The horror in clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of the black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day in the piercing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood, if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden aeons, which chills me now when I think of it, and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item in Notes of a Dead Professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think the professor, too, would intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 27, with the death of my granduncle, George Gamel Angel. Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded that after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder, as my great-uncle's heir and executor before he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers for some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated would later be published by the American Archaeological Society. But there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from shewing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of this queer clay bas-relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle, in his latter years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was rough rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5-6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of Cubism and Futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. In writing of some kind, the bulk of these designs seem certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even to hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphs was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded some simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. But it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was the vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of pressed cuttings, in Professor Angel's most recent hand, and made no pretense to the literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided in two sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream, and Dream work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, R.I. And the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Bienville, St. St. Street, New Orleans, LA, at 1908 AAS MTG. Notes on the same and Prof. Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons. Some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and Los Lemuria, and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to auteur, mental illnesses, and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angell, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest man of an excellent family slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone in the Fleur de Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious young youth and of known genius, but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the state folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of athletes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit, my friend the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked him for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics of the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy. And my uncle shewed some sharpness in relying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall it and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed, for I have made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or the garden-gilded, girdled Babylon." It was then that he began a rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleep memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, and the most considerable felt in New England in some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great Cyclopean cities and of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror.